Thanks for joining me. In this segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism with Penny Colpin, I am continuing on with the series involving better metaphors and analogies to describe my type of journey, my type of experiences. This segment will deal with accidents that happen and how people can find themselves in either dangerous situations or harmed or hurt, that type of thing. I'm remembering this time to say, look, I'm not giving medical advice. I have what's called lived experience. I'm just sharing things that either helped me or would have helped me through my own experiences. Because like too many people, I ended up traumatized worse by the mental health system than I did by a severe stress breakdown that I endured in 1998. Again, if you like what I'm doing, please subscribe, please like, share, pass along to people who might be adversely affected by what too often gets called serious mental illness. And what I've long said is what I experienced was no more an illness than a shattered, fractured leg. So the metaphor used in terms of describing at least my type of experience as an illness does not hold water. Speaking of which, the first metaphor and analogy I'm going to present is actually the name, is the title of the YouTube channel, A Belly Flop into Water. As I mentioned in the intro video that I set up 2 years ago, the phrase belly flopping into mysticism comes from a Joseph Campbell quote. Joseph Campbell was an American English professor, mythologist, studied myth around the world, but he had the quote. I should back up. He was the one who kind of popularized the idea of the hero's journey, which is used with many movies and films. But he had the quote that said, "The psychotic person drowns in the same water in which a mystic delights." So in that quote, there's a relationship between what gets called psychosis and what is often called mysticism. And so basically, as I heard that quote, I was like, well, hell, I fell in to that mystical consciousness, not even knowing it was there. I'd never really experimented with, I've never smoked marijuana. I'd put it this way: I've never smoked tobacco, much less anything stronger. Drink alcohol minimally. So it's not like I had a lot of experience with these non-ordinary or other states of consciousness. And I accidentally fell in when the ego collapsed back in 1998. So for me, that analogy of falling into water, and especially when you can't swim, but it's one thing to fall into calm water. It's another to fall into dark, murky, water with a lot of, dirt and sludge in it and kind of mucky and it's another to fall into just, rapids, a river running over rocks and boulders and that type of thing. So right there is a considerable amount of variability, is just what kind of water did a person fall into? And again, what kind of experiences might they have had with those different types of water consciousness? What's the temperature of the water? How did the person fall in? Just smacking the water. If you're coming from a certain height and you belly flop in, just that smack will take your breath away and make it more susceptible to drowning or being injured. Divers, I know, trained divers can break their arms, break their wrists, and get injured, even though, they're doing things training. So what about the schlub like me who I dove once off a high dive? Now keep in mind, I was a swimmer, but yeah, forget the high dive. So there's plenty of comparisons there, that by looking at the variability of what a person might fall into, how they ended up falling in. Did they trip on the shore and fall in over a ledge? Or did they kind of stumble and roll in and then the water was deeper than expected? There's all sorts of specifics that can be added to this analogy that could help a person try and describe something that's so intense. So, and of course, I love, water metaphors because I was a swimmer. I made a note that one of the songs that I thought of as I was putting this together is the song "She's Come Undone," and part of the lyrics are "She's come undone. She didn't know what she was heading for." And you can tell my response that all these years later, I'm like, yeah, that's a good one. I had no idea what I was heading for in that water. And not only that, once you're in the water, depending on flows and rip currents and that type of thing, you can end up with different types of water. You can end up with whirlpools, and then you pull your way out of that, and now all of a sudden you're facing some other challenge in a different type of water. So that's that. The next one I used, and I came up with this one, I think it was shortly even after I returned to the US from Banff back in 98, is that of like falling into a glacial crevasse. I was about 10 years old. My family moved to Montana when I was 9. And a year later, we went up to Glacier National Park, which is on the Canadian border, went camping, and mom stayed back at the campsite. And dad and I took over 2 days. Each day we took a 10-mile hike. And I remember we ended up, one of them was on Grinnell Glacier. And this was a long time ago. But I was going to say that's when the glaciers were bigger. But I remember we ended up catching up with a national park ranger who was leading a hike, and we kind of joined their group. And he pointed out some of the small crevasses. And he said, if you're ever crossing a glacier, you want to be real careful, because those glaciers, yeah, some of the crevasses you can see, but even getting up close, that ice can give way. Or you can be walking and, if you're not tapping out and checking the stability of the snow and ice in front of you, if you put enough weight on something, it'll give way and you'll fall into a crevasse. And of course, just that action of falling into a crevasse, I mean, these crevasses largely go almost straight down. They're quite a bit of vertical drop in a very short period of time. They're splits in the ice, if you're not familiar with glaciers and crevasses. And so if you end up in that, I mean, think of icy walls, that if you can't get one, if you're just out hiking and you don't have crampons on your feet, on your boots, trying to stop yourself mid-fall against something that's so slick, or something that, I guess it's not even that slick, but it's just the smoother surface. It's not like it's melted water along all that. But anyway, you can find yourself pretty deep pretty quickly. And so when I left Banff, it must have been around the time I was leaving Banff that I thought, gee, I hit bottom. Well, that wasn't the case. Because then when I returned to the US and fell through the cracks of the mental health system, I was really only about a third of the way down. And so what I thought was this deep crevasse, it's kind of like I got knocked off whatever resting point I was on and ended up falling even further into the depths. And that's a different problem, is that for things in the mental health system to shove you even further, or back to the belly flopping into water, to do something that shoves you into even more violent, difficult water by the very system that's supposed to help you, that's a different kind of problem, but it does happen. So for me, the glacial thing, yeah, that like I say, that was one of the early analogies and metaphors I came up with just shortly after I returned to the US from Banff. Again, I happened to make a note as I was a note about a song as I was writing this up, and I thought of the song "Hold On Loosely." I think it's by 38 Special. Hold on loosely, but don't let go. The way things are going, you're going to lose control. And there was something about just that, like clinging to this, whatever ledge I had in that glacial crevasse, that hold on loosely, but don't let go. It's that don't let go part. And, but then something else comes along and whacks you off, and you end up going further into the crevasse. I've already touched on another one, just even the concept of falling off some kind of ledge. Like if you're hiking, there's again going up to Glacier. I like Glacier quite a bit as well. It's on the way up to Banff. But there's the falling off a ledge, and there's a spot from Logan Pass as you go on. I forget the name of the trail that goes off along the garden wall. That actually it has into the rock on the side, kind of it's not a chain, but it's a cable. And so you can hold on to this cable. I mean, the path is still a few feet wide, but it's a pretty sheer drop just for a couple hundred feet. But I think of, a ledge that if you're out hiking and what happens, how did you fall off that ledge? I mean, were you careless and you just weren't paying attention and you got way too close? Or did something startle you and you kind of jumped and lost your balance? Or something knocked into you? And even even as I wrote that, I thought of one of the times I was hiking up on this ledge or this trail, and I'd come past where it was so narrow. But there was a mountain goat walking the trail my way. And so I ended up having to step off the trail to and it ended up going down. But there's pictures of people hiking on trails, and there's a bear coming from the other way. And, so I just thought, did some animal come your way? What was the terrain that you fell into? Did you get injured in the fall? And again, that goes more towards my thing of injury rather than illness, wounds rather than disease. And actually, I didn't make a note of this, but even as I'm talking about that, the song by Ozzy Osbourne, who passed in August, was Crazy Train. Mental wounds not healing, driving me insane. These are mental wounds, not illnesses. In general, you treat wounds differently than illnesses. So after the fall, did you get hurt? How did you get hurt? How does a person get their bearings? Can they right themselves? And that could be the same questions with the belly flop. How do you turn yourself in or upright? And then finally, another analogy, and this goes back to the Banff days, as I describe my experiences, when I say that goes back to the Banff, period, those are in the earliest stages. I mean, those are in the first couple of weeks after the moral injury happened, that I was already making some of these comparisons, whereas some of them came in, some of the observations or parallels or whatever came in weeks or months later. This one, I said, it's like being hit by the Mack truck. You're out on the interstate and are injured somehow. You're lying there traumatized and injured. The paramedics arrive, and the way I described it is they come up and say, "Oh, hey, you're injured. You need to get to the hospital. It's about 10 miles this direction. If you leave now, you'll get there in a few hours." Now, this one is the Mack truck, of course, is the impact of the experience. But this metaphor and analogy is about how the systems really didn't help me in a way that I expected, deserved, could have benefited from. That and actually it's just recently that it has to do with, no, what I was in was an emergent situation, was an urgent situation. And too often within the mental health environment, you are not considered an emergency unless you are, well, the way they say it is a threat to yourself or a threat to others. I have a lot more that I can talk to you about that. In fact, I'm looking at writing up maybe by the time I post this, I'll have my article done for Mad in America. But that creates a huge problem, because basically you're only an emergency if you're homicidal or suicidal and in a position to invoke considerable physical harm, even death, on yourself or someone else. That's how emergency is defined in the mental health system. No, I'm sorry, that's still just, and that's basically how I was treated. And I was even told before I went to Banff, when I called the PhD psychotherapist office or psychologist office that I'd worked with the year before, um, the office administrator asked, "Is this an emergency?" And I'm like, "Well, I don't know. I mean, I haven't slept all night. I'm lying here on my floor, sobbing and weeping, and I can't stop." And she said, "Are you homicidal or suicidal?" And I said, "Well, no." And she said, "Oh, well, that's not an emergency. Here, let me see when we can get you in." And that's when they scheduled me for the next Monday, which was supposed to be the day after I returned from Banff, but I ended up staying in Banff an extra day or an extra week to try and get my head together. So this idea of that's why this metaphor of, hey, I'm out on the interstate, bleeding and injured and wounded. Oh, no, you need to go do this. You need to turn in this paperwork. You need to contact this person. I'm the one with the blown mind. I'm the one in this fracturing, splintering process. And I would have liked some help. And I didn't think I need to qualify it by saying I needed competent help. And unfortunately, that kind of thing happens too much. I'll go ahead and mention that in early August in Montana, in the town of Anaconda, a man committed a mass shooting in a bar. It made national attention, killed 4 people, and then he hid out for a week before he was captured. And the reports were that he had been a vet. I think it was in Iraq. I'm not positive, but he had had mental health issues. It had been reported. So a week after that happened, I was downtown and I knew a woman who had grown up, she grew up in Anaconda and still had family there. And so I happened to see her and I said, how's your family and how, and at that time I didn't realize they'd caught the man, but 'cause this guy being out for a week was kind of concerning. And she said, "Oh, they caught him today." And then she mentioned how this man's niece had apparently shared to the media somehow and said that as his family, the man's parents had died, and apparently after his mother passed, his condition worsened quite a bit. But for some years, he'd initially been turned away from the VA from some types of benefits or medications. His family had contacted Warm Springs, which is the state mental hospital. It's actually, ironically, near Anaconda. But people, that's basically a commitment issued by courts. And basically his family was trying to get him some help and couldn't figure out that, because at the time he wasn't homicidal or suicidal until he was. Now that's my take. As I'm recording this in August, and there's still some material coming out, and who knows what the news cycle. But when this niece was saying, "Hey, we wanted to get help for him and couldn't," and I forget which article I read, but it was basically that he was not considered an emergency. That needs to change. Now, I'm not saying that a person needs to be involuntarily committed or anything like that. That's a whole different problem within this whole system. But when you can't even find a support group to work with to deal with grief that's exploded, that's part of what happened, or past trauma that's exploded, those are better models in terms of talking, or at least considering, as opposed to these are just illnesses that hit people. So, yeah, that's why this whole thing of, it's like being hit by a Mack truck, but I'm not an emergency. And it was really just the timing of this mass shooting. I've been thinking about it a lot the last, since early August, thinking another case where someone who, I don't know, they might not have even been in crisis. But what I've long suspected is that when someone belly flops into this mystical consciousness water, that water isn't necessarily positive. It isn't necessarily, wah, birds singing, unicorns, and all of that. It can be very, very difficult, challenging, frightening, experience. And to say that's not an emergency, really? So there's improvements to the model here that are also needed. So anyway, I didn't mean to end on, I'm sorry, again, I laugh, it's that thing of you can laugh or you can cry. See, I'm the one who has a number of memories around this. And at some point, you have to laugh at the absurdity of it. But boy, let me tell you, when you're in it, it's a lot harder to do that. And that's part of why I'm doing what I'm doing, is that this concept that, oh, we're dealing with illnesses and we're just going to ignore past trauma, we're going to ignore experiences, we're going to ignore the environment that people are in. No, that needs to change. And even as I say that, I'm reminded of something my high school physics teacher said at the start of one of his lectures, my junior year. He said, one of the hardest things you'll ever do, or you'll ever need to do, is uneducate someone in order to re-educate them. And he was talking in terms of people misunderstanding, physical components or elements. He used the case of centripetal force versus centrifugal force. But that came out, that was in high school and I was in my early 30s. And somewhere along the line, that memory came forth that there's this dominant model, this dominant analogy that is really poor for a significant percentage of people. Some people love it. Some people embrace it. And so I'm not saying it can't be useful, but it sure as hell wasn't useful for my type of experience, or at least for my experience. And that's where having a broader spectrum of these different metaphors and analogies can help advance the ball overall in better understanding what these types of processes are. Off my soapbox. And again, thanks for joining me. Like, share, subscribe if you like. Yeah, I'm at least trying to get some ideas out there, continue the discussion, and hopefully bring about some much needed change to an overly simplified approach to dealing with complex issues. So take care. Thanks so much.